On? I'm hearing yes, so I'm going to proceed. I'm going to start the recording here, as I've been told to do.
Recording in progress.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a joint meeting of the Lunenburg Finance Committee and the Lunenburg School Committee. My name is Peter Beardmore. I'm chairman of the Finance Committee, and I'm going to call the Finance Committee to order.
And I am Carol Ashambo. I'm chairman of the School Committee, and I will call the School Committee to order.
Okay, so with no further ado, would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, by way of announcements, I just want to set the tone for tonight's meeting and let everybody know how we're set up and what we intend to do for this evening. This evening, the primary purpose of our joint meeting is to have a presentation and discussion on Chapter 70 funding. We have a guest speaker who Mrs. Archambault will introduce in a moment from the Massachusetts Association of School Committees. And our intent this evening really is to dive into Chapter 70, to learn more about what Chapter 70 is all about, the mechanics by which Chapter 70 funds come to Lunenburg for purposes of education, and to get some understanding of where Lunenburg stands with respect to our funding situation. As most of you have heard me talk about over the course of the last year or so, we've noticed that the Finance Committee, or anybody really looking at our budget numbers at town meeting over the last couple of years, have noticed that our Chapter 70 money, while it has increased nominally, has been relatively flat, certainly when compared to our overall contribution to education, both to the Lunenburg School District as well as Monty Tech. It's not keeping up with our contribution, nor with our overall town budget. And so you can imagine if those trends were to continue for years to come, that will, likely affect our ability to maintain or deliver the necessary services that we all would want to deliver in our school department. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is really to get educated, to learn more about it, and then ultimately together to decide what are the best paths or routes to look at to potentially improve our standing. One other note that I want to make, while we have members of the Finance Committee and School Committee, and we have a couple of members of the Select Board joining us on Zoom tonight, our legislative delegation was invited to participate tonight. Initially, they did accept, and I expected all three members to be here this evening. However, the legislative schedule changed a couple of weeks ago, and both houses are in formal session today, and I guess ultimately this evening, and our legislators are unable to attend. Representative Kushmarek reached out to me this week about a possible rescheduled date. He suggested the 9th of December, which is our next regularly scheduled meeting of the Finance Committee, and I invited him to attend that meeting, which he has accepted. But I have not yet heard from Senator Cronin or Representative Sina yet. But I expect that at that meeting on December 9th, we will likely have a follow-on discussion from what we learned this evening, and include our legislators in that discussion and see where we land from there. So with that, I'm sure I forgot something else pertinent, but maybe Mrs. Archambault will think of it. And
Okay.
If not, please go ahead and introduce our
And
speaker.
we'll go right ahead.
Okay.
It's my pleasure to introduce Tracy O'Connell Novick, who is our a field director from Massachusetts Association of School Committees, and also a member of the Worcester School Committee. And she is an expert, I'm told, on all things school finance. So we are happy to have her here and to learn what we can about Chapter 70.
I did remember what I forgot.
did
Before
you
you,
forget?
so welcome, Mrs. Novick. I forgot to read the preamble, which I need to do.
Okay.
So I
ahead.
apologize, but this is a
Nope,
public
that's
meeting, so
important.
let me read it, and I apologize. So in accordance with open meeting law, please be advised that this meeting is being recorded and broadcast over the Lunenburg Public Access Channel and on Facebook Live on the Public Access Facebook page. The following information is provided for members of the public who would like to participate in the meeting remotely. To participate remotely from a computer using the Zoom app, please use the link provided in the agenda, which can be found on lunenburgmass.gov, or from a telephone, you can dial toll-free 888-475-4499. The webinar ID is 875-6622-6087, passcode 700402. Please note that the available Zoom option, broadcast, and recordings are for the convenience of the public. If any technical difficulties were to occur, the meeting will continue. If you wish to continue to participate, you must report to this location on this notice and be aware and plan accordingly. And the agenda, of course, lists all the topics which may be discussed at the meeting and are those reasonably anticipated by the chair. Votes may be taken as a result of these discussions. Not all listed items may be in fact discussed, and other items not listed may also be brought up for discussion to the extent permitted by open meeting law. I would lastly add that while this is a joint meeting for the benefit of the public that is not able to see an agenda, when the school committee adjourns, the finance committee will continue to meet. So we'll take a short break, the finance committee will take the stage, and we'll have a short business meeting following that.
All right.
That said, thank you so much. I apologize for
That's important
interrupting
stuff.
your introduction, but we are now in compliance.
Very good. So I will do the traditional, I'm going to share my screen. So as I was saying to Ms. Archambault before you all started, though I currently live in Worcester, I actually grew up in Sterling, and Lunenburg is familiar territory for me because I am among those who can count my straight teeth to the good work of Dr. Walker, and monthly trips up here to the orthodontist office. So it's good to be back. And I do want to also just compliment you all because one of the first steps to actually being able to not only have a good understanding, but actually serve your district well, is to actually get the school committee and the FinCom together at the table. So even just your willingness to have a joint meeting and have a joint presentation is a really good indication of your willingness to serve your students well. So in terms of what I'm planning to do here with my presentation, the first is to give you a really thorough understanding of Chapter 70. I have a couple of different presentations that I do on Chapter 70, and some of them are deeper dives than others, and this is one of the deeper dives, because particularly from the FinCom's perspective, I think it's important for you all to have a strong understanding of how the municipal calculation portion works, which tends to be the place that I more lightly pedal if I'm talking to school committees. And then to then immediately sort of flip that into how that particularly applies here. I see Mr. Cassidy's here. Thank you for sharing your end of year report, because that meant that I could then immediately apply it to where you're at right now. I was also asked to give you a little bit of a picture in terms of circuit breaker, what that is, and how it's calculated, and also what your numbers look like locally. And I've got a couple of slides as well on Monty Tech tuition. I pulled some things from their budget as well as from their state funding. I certainly can take questions at the end, but I'm also happy to take questions as they come up too, because sometimes people like to stop along the way because it's complicated. So I think it's always important, and it feels fun to be doing this in a building that looks like this one, which is sort of quintessential New England, to ground us in where the school finance actually comes from. which in Massachusetts, it's actually grounded right on the state constitution, which was written by John Adams it was passed in 1780. Massachusetts, as you may know, was the first state in the country to have language in the original constitution that spoke specifically to public education as a responsibility of government. And then a lot of the states actually copied our language thereafter, which is fine. It's good language. But as well as talking about why we have public education, which is to essentially continue to have a government, and a democratic government at that, this is also specifically where the school finance portion of the law comes from. When there was a lawsuit that happened in the 90s, it was based on the constitutional language and whether or not the state was actually fulfilling its constitutional obligation to the children of Massachusetts. And that's really this middle portion here, which talks about it being the duty of legislatures and magistrates to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences, and then you see it mentions at the end public schools and grammar schools in the town. And what that means is that it's actually the state's obligation to ensure that there's public education at the K through 12 level. And that then, as a result of this lawsuit, which was the McDuffie lawsuit that happened in 1993, Massachusetts General Law Chapter 70 was passed, and the opening section says here that the intent is to have a fair and adequate per student funding for public schools, and then also to have a standard local funding effort that's applicable to every city and town in the Commonwealth. So when we talk about Chapter 70, which is the shorthand that we all use, really what we're doing is we're simply referencing the Massachusetts General Law Chapter 70. We use it as a shorthand for state funding for education, but what we're doing is we're referencing the Massachusetts General Law. There's a lot of other things that happened in Chapter 70, but MGL Chapter 70 is really all about education funding. So effectively then what Chapter 70, the Massachusetts General Law, does is it lays out those two portions, which is that per pupil funding calculation, and then the standard calculation for every city and town in terms of where the funding is going to come from. And that's the sort of the two halves of the equation, which I here put as how much does it actually cost and who's going to pay for it. So the first part of that question is what the state has done is it's broken apart the cost of a public school education for each child into a series of discrete categories. In other words, and sometimes I've done this particularly when I'm meeting with students, give me a list of what do you need in order to run a school. And given enough time, most people would come up with most of this list. School committees would cheat because they'd actually remember things like health insurance. But, most people are going to get that you need teachers and you got to keep the heat on and you're going to need some supplies and those kinds of things. And that's exactly what the categories are that are within this calculation. Those together, bundled, become what's known as the base foundation amount, which is a per pupil amount. And it's discrete by the grade level and to some degree also by what the student is doing. So this base foundation amount, and I've given you the FY20, it's actually should say 22, sorry, not 23, I can't see that far into the future yet. Pre-K and kindergarten for half day, full day kindergarten, elementary, middle, high school, and then you'll see that vocational has its own level. So this is the base foundation amount. It's for each student in the Commonwealth, depending on their grade level. To that, the state then is going to add two things that it acknowledges as costing more. So it acknowledges that students who are low income are coming in with other needs that may need to be met. There's an additional increment that then is put on top of this base foundation amount for low income students. And there's an additional increment for students who are learning English. The way that those work, and I did this all the way through, you can tell I actually really do operate in a school finance universe, right? There's already people who are working on the FY23 budget, so I've already jumped there. These are 22 numbers. I'll fix this when I give it to you. Depending on the level of the student, there is this additional increment pre-K through 5, grades 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12. I should note that all of these numbers are moving. Some of them more than others. In particular, English language learners is actually going to be increasing. And something we're going to be seeing over the next several years is that the grades 9 through 12 is eventually going to be the highest category, because something that we've understood since we implemented the foundation budget, and something that did change as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. We used to have this idea that kids who were learning English were coming from families that didn't speak English at home as kindergartners, and then they came to the public schools, and by the time they were halfway through elementary school, they probably were pretty fluent. And now, of course, we know that kids come to us at all grade levels, with all kinds of levels of things, and if we only have a couple of years left with them in K through 12 education, it's really that much more important, and we need potentially that many more resources in order to make them get them to where they need to be by the end of high school. So eventually that 9 through 12 category will be the highest. And then something that's been happening with low income, and I just want to spend a minute on this because it's been switching and it's sort of continuing to switch. We used to have this sort of very straightforward kind of calculation for low income, which was that if you were turning in a form for free or reduced lunch, you got counted as low income. We had something happen during the middle part of the teens, really beginning in about FY15 or so, where there was a federal program that was implemented where if you had a certain proportion of your students that were counted as free or reduced lunch, that you could actually convert that into an eligibility for all of your students to receive free and reduced lunch, which is great. And I mean, we have the program in Worcester, I have no complaints. But it did mean that those districts effectively stopped collecting those forms. And we got a couple of years into this, and it was particularly the big urban districts that had made those flips, as you might imagine. And the state started to get a little antsy because we were kind of counting this two different ways. Like we had sort of Boston and Springfield kind of in this grandfathered category, and everybody else was still collecting forms. And they said, hang on, we can't do this. We need a standard way of doing it. So they switched the whole state in FY17 to what's called economically disadvantaged counting, which means that if a student is enrolled in any of these state programs that I've listed here for you, then they count as economically disadvantaged. So that every district does it that way. Now, this was good in that it got us all to the same point. However, and this won't surprise any of you who kind of know how, in particular, I think people's relationships with school districts can work. There were more families that turned in the forms than enrolled in the state programs. And so we lost students in that count. Now the state bumped the dollar amount, but there were some complaints, particularly from districts that had a great many students that were lost in the count, both because it actually impacted their budget, but also because it felt as if we kind of stopped counting those kids as poor, even though they are. And so there's been this pushback. As part of the Student Opportunity Act, they're coming around with another way of counting again. They're still figuring that part out for sure. But this year, as a transition year, they are choosing one of two ways to do this, whichever is higher. They're either going back to your FY16 count of students, which was most people were still turning in forms at that point, using that percentage and applying it to your current student enrollment, or they're using your actual direct certification, which is the economically disadvantaged, whichever one is higher. So what does this end up doing to the statewide count? Just to give you an idea, we kind of swing all over the place here, right? So 16 is the last year where we were turning in the forms. You see that it drops pretty substantially. We were picking students up because there's better matching going on right along. 21 is kind of a wash in terms of the year, and then 22 is this odd year where we're picking everybody's higher number. I think we'll probably, if 23, if they move forward with a steady system, we'll probably see a drop again, but it's probably going to put us back more around where we were with 20 or 21 rather than shoving us way backwards a whole bunch. So this is what the 22 low income numbers are. Something that I want to note to you is that This is based on the percentage of students in your district that are considered low income. And it intentionally is very, very progressive, because the idea is that the higher the concentration of students you have that live in a lot of need, the greater the need the school district then has to meet those students' needs. This is one of the big things that's shifting under the Student Opportunity Act. By the time we get fully implemented in what should now be 5 years from now, this far right-hand column, the 12th column, should be equal to the full middle school base foundation amount. In other words, if you have a student who is low income in the highest concentration of poverty district, that student within the foundation budget will get another, effectively a doubling count in terms of the amount of dollars that are proportioned to them.
What are the labels on those?
Were the labels on them?
1 through 12.
So I was originally being clever in calling them duodeciles, which is even twelfths. It turns out, though, that they're not. And if you want, I can pull up the foundation budget category. But what they've done is they've broken the percentages down, and they're actually not even twelfths. They're closer to, I think they're trying to keep the number of districts or the number of students more equal across the thing. But it isn't as if they took all of the districts and just divided them up into 12s. But and what are the dollars? So this is, let me show you actually. So it would be, let me see. Yeah, okay, so let's do this one. This is what it is going to end up looking like, is for an individual student who is an elementary student who's also an English language learner and is low income, you would have this base foundation amount plus the low increment amount plus the English learner increment on top. And sort of that would be that one individual student. Is that clearer? Maybe. Okay.
Because I still don't understand the decile.
So they're not actually deciles. I should stop using the word decile. There's 12 divisions that are based on the concentration of poverty in your district. So the top one, for example, is if you have, nobody has 100% poverty. I think there are districts that have, say, 95% of their students are in poverty, and I'm making this part up, but like 95% of their students in poverty down to 85% of their students in poverty. Then the next one would be 84% to 75% and so forth like that.
So each town is in one of
So each school district is in one of these 12 categories. Yep. And sorry for not explaining that clearly. It was honestly easier when there were 10 divisions and they were more even. What I'm trying to decide, I don't like to clutter my charts too much, but maybe I need to start putting the percentages on the bottom so that you get some idea of where they're coming from. So the other thing that's included in this calculation, but isn't actually tied to students, is special education. So there is an acknowledgement of 1% of your student enrollment as being an out-of-district special education placements. And there is an acknowledgement currently in this current year of 3.82% of your in-district, of special education for your in-district students. Now, they're much more sizable dollar amounts. However, as you may have gotten from the previous slide, it is not based on actual counts. So low income is based on actual counts, right? Kids who are actually enrolled in those state categories. English learners, actual count of students who are, who haven't tested out of English learning programs. Enrollment, actual kids who are sitting in desks. Special education is not associated with individual students. It's just how many kids do you have? Here's the percentage we're calculating. That's the dollar amount you get. One of the things that is perhaps least satisfying to people who do this calculation. So this is the chart that I gave you before in terms of what does this look like if you're taking an individual child. Base foundation amount for elementary plus a low income increment for any student that has it. plus the English learner increment for any child that has it, which then can give you a total in terms of that student. Obviously then, each student varies widely, right, in terms of what their need is. And then also that low income increment obviously also varies widely in terms of what the proportion of the number of students that are in the district that are actually considered low income. The other thing I want to mention, and this actually goes directly into kind of the conversation we were talking about at the beginning, the other thing that impacts the calculation of the foundation budget is an inflation rate, which sounds like good news. However, this is actually the historic inflation rate for the foundation budget going back to 1998. And I want to sort of note a couple of things here. First of all, it has been negative more than once. For those of us who are particularly dependent on the foundation budget, like in Worcester, those were not fun years, but they weren't great for anyone. The second thing that I want to note, though, is that I am going to bet that any of you who have been around public budgeting of any kind probably have not seen your costs go up by these percentages in any of these years. So, for example, for the current calendar year, for the current fiscal year, the foundation budget for most categories was an increase of 1.43%. Health insurance, as a result of the Student Opportunity Act, has its own inflationary increase, which is 2.78%, which is based on the state GIC of the past 3 years. However, I'm willing to bet, I mean, for school districts, generally speaking, costs go up by about 3% a year, with the exception of health insurance. Not uncommon for that to go up more like 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10% in a year. So clearly, and this actually I think is really a good picture more than anything else of one of the issues that has plagued all budgets, is that this simply does not actually reflect the actual cost of sort of doing business, right, of running a town, of running a school district. And so this is one of the two ways that the foundation budget changes from year to year, with the other one being your student enrollment changing. So the foundation budget goes up if you have a larger number of students. It also goes up if you have more students who are in poverty. It goes up if you have more students who are learning English. If none of those things is happening, if you're not seeing more students, if you're not seeing more students with higher need, then really the only increase that's built into the foundation budget is going to be the inflation rate. There isn't any other input to this. So really the two ways the foundation budget changes is enrollment and the inflation rate. And I always want to make sure people actually have seen what we mean by the inflation rate. It's actually the cost deflator index for state and local governments. It's based on the previous year's spending of state and local governments. It's not the inflation rate that we see talked about in headlines. So that's the other way that your foundation budget can go up. So in terms of, and again, this is 23, really got to work on where my brain is in terms of what budget year we're in. This is your current foundation budget by the categories that we just talked about. Now, the other thing that I want to make sure I mention here is that your student enrollment is based on the prior October. Mm-hmm. So Lunenburg Public Schools has filed a count for October 1 this month that will then be the calculation next year of their foundation budget. So this enrollment count is not this October's enrollment count, it's last October's enrollment count, okay? So 34 students in pre-K, you see the per pupil amount there, and so on down the line with full day kindergarten, elementary school, high school, and so forth. Couple things I want to note. If it's in italics, those are the increments on top of the base foundation amount. So in other words, don't try to just total the whole enrollment category. It won't total because the students that are down below are already counted up above in their grade levels. Do remember that the special education is a percentage. It is not based on actual counts. And then you can see how the multiplier works out across the categories. My guess is that for many of you, with the exception probably of Mr. Cassidy, this $18 million figure is probably not one that you necessarily have seen, because it really only has so much to do with what you actually are doing on a day-to-day basis. There are districts in which this would matter quite a bit, but there are ones that are much more heavily dependent on state aid and perhaps don't see any funding above that which is required. So that's the first half of the question, which is the state coming up with this minimum per pupil calculation. That's what the foundation budget is. That's all the foundation budget is. The second half is if the state says that you need $18.4 million in order to educate your kids in the district, who's going to come up with that $18.4 million? So the state says for the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts, taking all of those separate foundation budget calculations for every district in the Commonwealth and adding them together, that they're going to have the towns pay for 59%, and the state is going to pick up 41%. Now that's at the statewide calculation, okay? That's not individual town calculations. That's saying your total plus Leominster's total plus Worcester's total, right, plus everybody's total. That's kind of undergirding all of the rest of what we're going to talk about here. So when the state then tries to figure out how much of individual districts' calculations each town is going to pay for, it starts with two numbers. The first thing it does is it looks at the equalized valuation of all taxable property in all of the cities and towns in the Commonwealth. Okay, and it adds them all up together. So this is pulled straight out of everybody's tax calculations at the town district level. DOR does this. Again, everywhere in the state, added up together as a full total. The other thing it looks at is it looks at income. So derived annually from the Department of Revenue filings, it says, okay, who filed in the town of Lunenburg and your zip code? But it also then adds them up for the whole state. How much should everybody pay in income taxes? Then it does a calculation. It takes that total amount of the property revenue, and it takes the total amount of the income revenue, and it sets them equal to each other. So I'm talking to a bunch of FinCom people, so this may not make your eyes cross the way that it makes others. But if you remember from learning about decimals, the way that you set two numbers equal to each other is you multiply one by a number greater than one, and you multiply the other one by a number less than one. And that's what the state does. It comes up with what the calculation is to set those two giant dollar amounts equal to each other. It does that calculation every year, and then it derives these two decimals that it then is going to carry forward into a calculation for every city and town in the Commonwealth. So this is in that opening section of Chapter 70, when it says a common calculation for every city and town in the Commonwealth. This is how they do that. This is where that number comes from. So you're going to see this 0.3311 percentage and the 1.4135 percentage show up later on in your calculation, but it's also in, Leominster's, and it's in Worcester's, and it's in Martha's Vineyard. It's in every single city and towns in the entire state. Okay, so that's the common calculation that Chapter 70 talks about. So what does that end up meaning for you? So they're going to take your local property wealth, and they're going to take all of the income taxes that were filed locally, and they do this by zip code. They're going to multiply it by those common decimals that it got from the statewide calculation, and those numbers added together are going to be what is known as your combined effort yield. This is, when I'm explaining this to school committees in particular, this is the way that the state has of saying, here's how much we think you can afford to spend on public education. Because if you think about it, how are you going to say to, I don't need to keep explaining this to you, but a town as different as Lunenburg is from Leominster, how do you say to them, how much can each of you afford to spend on public education? It does a common calculation for each one, again, based on your property wealth and your income wealth locally. That's your combined effort yield. So that's that right from Chapter 70. standard of local funding effort applicable to every city and town in the Commonwealth. Okay, that's that opening section. So it then takes that calculation, the combined effort yield, and it compares it back to your foundation budget. That base amount, that how much is it going to cost to educate your kids in your school district. 82.5% is the most that every community is required to contribute towards their foundation budget. This is the state's way of saying everybody gets some state aid regardless of how much wealth they have locally. Or your combined effort yield. It looks at those two numbers and it says which one is less. The one that is less is considered your target contribution. Okay, that's where the state's trying to get you to. It then actually takes a look at things that have happened in the past, because the state realizes that, we can't just sort of come parachuting in and say, well, you've got to come up with this amount of money. There's been a history here. How much did you contribute to your schools last year? And then how much did your local economy grow this year? So there's a municipal revenue growth factor that's calculated in. They take the amount that you contributed your previous year to schools, and they multiply it by the municipal revenue growth factor, which is, again, a standard calculation of how much your economy grew locally. And that they then compare that to your original target, and they figure out how close it is. They're going to do a calculation that will then they don't try to push you way up or push you way down if you're far off your target. They bring it within particular percentage points. But the comparison effectively they're doing is how close are you to your target and how much can they move you towards it if you need to go up or down. So, again, this should be 23. This should be 22, excuse me. I keep acting as if I can see the future and I can't. So this is what your numbers look like for Lunenburg, okay? The equalized property valuation for 22 is based on 2020 numbers. Not surprisingly, right? People actually dispute their property taxes sometimes, so they give you a year or two lag. So in 2020, your equalized property valuation for the town was $1.6 billion. They then multiply it by that same commonality. Actually, this is different. And I think I must not have updated it after the House and Senate agreed with each other. That then gives you your local effort from property wealth. You'll notice the income taxes have an even greater lag on them. Those get disputed too. So for FY22, we're looking at 18's income. You've got $459 million reported from your local zip code in income. The uniform income percentage, again, that was applied across the entire state, 1.41. And that gives you a local effort from income. And here's your combined effort yield, right? $12 million is what the state says that the local town can contribute to public education. So, what's your 22 foundation budget? $19.8 million. Wait, those of you who were retaining numbers in your head. Lunenburg Public Schools foundation budget was only 18.4. Yes, but this is the town of Lunenburg's foundation budget, and as you all know, the other contribution that you need to make is to Monty Tech. This actually includes your contribution to Monty Tech as well as your K through 12 foundation. Okay, so important to realize that when you're looking at the municipal calculation, your foundation budget won't match if you belong to a regional school district as well. So your maximum local contribution is at 82.5% of that 19.8 million. The target contribution remains 12. Remember, the state takes the lower of the two numbers. So your target local share then is the $12 million. That's 60% of your FY22 foundation budget. And so where is that compared to where you have been in the past? Well, in FY21, your required local contribution was $11.3 million. Municipal revenue growth factor for the past year was 3.86%. So preliminary contribution, multiplying one by the other, is $11.7 million, which is 59%. Remember, your target was the 60.69, so they need to try to bump you up a bit. What's the difference? And you'll see here it actually even explains in line 23 how much are they going to bring you up. It really depends on how far away you are. In terms of your shortfall, because your shortfall is 1.43%, they're going to effectively going to leave you where you're at that 59.26% because you're within that kind of margin. If you're less than 2%, they don't actually change the number. By the way, this chart, as well as the foundation budget calculation, it's all part of a spreadsheet that's on the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's website. And they do this calculation for every city and town, again, based on those same standard numbers in terms of the percentages. So, as we said, Lunenburg belongs to more than one district. You have your K through 12 district, but you also have Monty Tech. So what they do as part of the spreadsheet is they actually show you how it divides up in terms of your foundation enrollment, the foundation budget, both for last year and for this year, how much of the foundation budget you're contributing or you're responsible for, and then your required contribution. We'll come back to Monty Tech at the end. I have the separate calculations that are actually the Monty Tech regional calculations, but I did want to show you just that that actually does get fed into your foundation budget calculation as well. And that's where this sort of total is coming from in terms of your foundation, your required local contribution change from one year to the next. It's based first on the K through 12 district, but it's also based on the number of students you have enrolled at Monty Tech. So, how then do we get you to your foundation? And by this point, by the way, we're switching back over to the K through 12 district. So we're not talking about the town anymore. We're getting back over to the $18.4 million. The first thing the state does is it has the town's contribution. So the town is responsible for contributing $10.9 million, again, based on local revenue and income. The state then is going to fill the gap between that required local contribution, which remember was 59% of your foundation budget, between that and the foundation budget, which is another $7.5 million. That's how you get to the foundation budget, which is what the state originally calculated as being $18.4 million. However, that's not the only calculation that they do. And here's why. So in FY21, your Chapter 70 aid was $7.7 million. And, that was great, whatever. However, if we run the calculation again, if you look in the middle section of this spreadsheet, your foundation budget is $18.4 million. Required local contribution was the 10.9. State's responsible for giving you $7.5 million. I have a sneaking suspicion that if your legislative delegation showed up on December 9th and said, so we're going to give you $7.5 million when last year we gave you $7.7 million, there wouldn't be a lot of happy faces in the room. So the other thing that the state does is it looks back at your previous year and it says, the first thing that's going to happen is you're not going to lose any state aid. So that's a hold harmless calculation that the state includes every year. For you all, it's you can actually sort of look at the number right there and figure it out. It's about $220,000, and then it brings you up by a minimum per pupil increase. And this is exactly the sort of nominal increase that you talked about seeing in terms of your state aid. That's exactly what it is. It is a nominal increase. It used to be that we'd have a debate every year during the budget discussion as to what exactly it was going to be. It's now right in the Student Opportunity Act, it's written into the state law, that it's going to be a $30 per pupil increase. So that's the $49,000 that you saw as an increase for this year. And I just gave it to you as a separate chart because I wanted you to actually see it pulled apart like this. So that you've got the local required contribution, then you've got the foundation aid, which is $7.5 million. Then you've got the hold harmless, which is the $273, which says you're not going backwards from last year, and then the $49,000 increase. So that is not an uncommon phenomenon. I just wanted to sort of give you an idea. I pulled these numbers last year at the beginning of the budget deliberation, so they're not necessarily updated. This is from last January. You're not in an uncommon situation in terms of you wouldn't otherwise be seeing increases in state aid. And in fact, you might well be seeing your state aid go backwards if it weren't for hold harmless and minimum per pupil increases. And actually, just to be fair, this actually doesn't include the biggest one of all because it totally throws off my chart if I put Boston on. Boston gets, I think last year it was about $65 million in hold harmless and minimum student increases. But you'll see that they're kind of all over the place. Franklin kind of stands out as $11.3 million, but Billerica gets 10. And again, this largely is based on declines in student enrollment. And then what happens is that over time, if you see those per pupil increases build up, while the foundation budget is not actually increasing, the gap between the two continues to get larger and larger and larger. And so that's what has happened with a number of districts. So that's part of the answer to sort of where is Lunenburg in terms of the Student Opportunity Act. But I did want to point out to you that in terms of the things that are the big money in terms of the Student Opportunity Act, there are 4 main financial changes that came into the foundation budget. There are other financial impacts, some of which are actually going to impact you, but there are 4 main financial calculations that went into the foundation budget that changed. The first is health insurance, and you already saw that, right? That was the pulling apart of the inflation so that health insurance isn't just getting whatever that, the 1.78% or whatever it is. It is tied to the state GIC rate. Now, I would argue, and frankly I already have, that we still don't seem to be seeing percentages that are where they need to be. They probably aren't actually really what health insurance is. They're better than they were. That will impact you. Those are not huge dollar changes. It will make a difference, but it's not a huge dollar change. And again, it goes into your foundation budget. The more your foundation budget goes up, it's going to impact whether or not you're getting as much hold harmless. I don't know that it's going to necessarily bump you all that much. Health insurance, you're seeing a change in terms of the percentage of students that are counted for in-district special education. Again, not big numbers, and remember that's it's going to stop at 4%. And again, remember it's effectively never going to be your actual count. So, is it a difference? Yes. Is it a game changer for necessarily anyone? Probably not. English learners and low income, and in particular low income, are the ones where there are big dollar changes. However, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here because you know your numbers, I'm going to point out that this is what your enrollment looks like in terms of English language learners, right? 14, again, last October 1, 14 students that were English learners in pre-K to 5, 1 in K through 6, 2 in 9 through 12, and 353 students that are low income out of a student enrollment of 16,000. So you are not a district that's got a ton of students that are low income, which means that number isn't going to bump high either. None of which is to try to be harsh here, but just sort of explain why these numbers aren't going to change. So that's actually not, that part of the Student Opportunity Act is going to be a game changer for Fitchburg, for Leominster, for, it's actually not going to be for Boston, for Springfield, for districts that have a large number of low-income students. That's really where the big change is, because that was actually really where the big gap was. What I did, though, want to give you a perspective on was how does what I gave you was not all of your budget. That was just the foundation budget. Remember, that was the state's minimum calculation. That isn't all that you do, and that isn't all the money that you spend. So you've got the local required contribution of the 10, and this is, by the way, the previous year. This is based on what you actually reported. So this is last year, FY21. Last year, your local required contribution was $10.1 million. You got, as we said, $7.7 million in Chapter 78, all of it together. And then what I did was I went through and looked at what did you get in federal grants, what did you get in state grants, what did you get for circuit breaker. There was, I think, other required contributions in here. And then the big difference is that you spent an additional spent last year an additional $11.3 million in terms of your local contribution. So there's another, what are we talking here? Maybe 40% of your budget that is local contribution over and above the minimum that you're required to spend. Those are local dollars that you're putting towards public education that you're not required to. Now, that isn't to say that that is unusual. The statewide average the year before last, I didn't look at last year's, was 29%. So most districts in the state spend substantially more than they minimally are required to spend on public education. This honestly is part of the reason why the Student Opportunity Act happened as well, because part of what happened was the legislature looked around and said, if you look around the state, most cities and towns are spending much more than they are required to on public education. And that's in part, yes, because we have a high value on education in Massachusetts, but it's also because they are not able to meet their actual costs if all they do is spend the foundation budget. I don't think that anyone probably sitting here can imagine trying to run the Lunenburg Public Schools on $18.4 million a year. I know that the budget that you passed was something like 29. So that's not, again, not an unusual situation to be in. That's where a lot of towns in the Commonwealth are. And that's partly because of health insurance and special education, but it's also partly because when you actually looked at the needs of your town and your community, you said, actually, we want smaller class sizes than that. We want to have additional services than that, and we don't think that we can get them for the amount of money that is minimally allocated. So this is actually just giving you that same breakdown. Among other things, it bothered me that the athletic fund, $176, wasn't going to show in the bar chart, so I gave it to you this way as well. And also, I was presenting to the FinCom, so I wanted you to see the actual dollar breakdown. So again, just to give it to you in terms of the graph this way, that's actually how your budget breaks down in terms of revenue sources. And this was the actual spending last year for 21. School budgets that don't tend to change that much from this year to the next. But as I was noting before we started, everybody's charts that look like this are going to go haywire in the next couple of years because of ESSER and ARPA funds, right? The federal line is going to go haywire. So just keep that in mind. So that's your Chapter 70 picture. I do want to mention special education circuit breaker for two reasons. First of all, because proportional to the size of your budget, it is actually a substantial revenue source for you. And also because it's another thing that actually changed as part of the Student Opportunity Act. And that was intentional. The legislature knew, looking at the Student Opportunity Act, that yes, there were going to be districts that were major beneficiaries, but then there were districts that really weren't. And some of the things that they were impacted by, they actually then included in the Student Opportunity Act. This is one. Charter reimbursement, by the way, is another one. Traditionally, the way that they have calculated the circuit breaker is that for any individual student that hits a spending level of more than 4 times the statewide average per pupil foundation budget, the circuit flips, and the state then starts a reimbursement process. Now, it's always with the subsequent year. It's based on your last year. And it's 75% of what is spent over that dollar amount. The SOA did two things. The first thing it did was it actually froze the dollar amount at the FY21 level. Now, that sounds a little odd until you think about what's going to happen to the foundation budget as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. The statewide foundation budget is going to go up and up and up in terms of the per pupil, which means that you would forever have been chasing that level to get to the when you actually start to get reimbursement. And the state said, no, we're not going to play that game. We're going to set it at a standard level. It's not going to move. Once you get to that level in that individual student's spending, everything over that gets reimbursed at 75%. The thing that they added to this, and I suspect this probably will matter for you because I looked at your dollar amounts, is they're phasing in transportation for out-of-district students being part of the reimbursement. This year, it's 25% of that, and then it gets phased in so that eventually 100% of the transportation is eligible for reimbursement. Again, it's still, once it's over that dollar amount of the 21 four times foundation amount, but that is something where I suspect that you're going to continue to see increases. And transportation in many cases, and again, I think perhaps the school committee may be aware of this, can sometimes cost as much as the tuition for some students. Now, given the amount that you're spending on out of district that then was eligible from the spreadsheets that I pulled, I gave you the past couple of years, which is what the state had online. you're clearly going to continue to see circuit breaker increase. You probably would anyway, I'm guessing, but with the transportation now being eligible, that's absolutely something that's going to benefit you all. So that's a piece to keep in mind. In terms of Monty Tech, and I could barely fit their spreadsheet on the screen. I always forget how big, Monty Tech's one of my districts, but I always forget how many towns they have. They have the same spreadsheets online that every town and district does. Though because they're a regional, it breaks down differently. There is that foundation budget calculation for each town. And then for each of the towns, depending on sort of what they do with all of their students, some of the towns are a member of multiple regionals. Some of the towns have, much like you do, a town district and then are just part of Monty Tech. But you have the same breakdown in terms of how many students are enrolled, what the change is from one year to the next, what the contribution is from each of the towns, and then the change. So this is actually pulled off of Monty Tech's foundation budget calculation chart. You can actually, I just want to make sure that you know that behind these numbers is the same calculation that we ran for yours. So you always will see the change in student enrollment, because that's sort of as I said, the main change from one year to the next in your foundation budget is your student enrollment. Obviously, those are pretty significantly volatile for regional vocational districts. Like, that's actually a big part of how their budget changes, foundation budget changes from one year to the next. The other way, of course, is the same inflationary factor that everybody has. But behind the calculation in terms of how much you contribute is not only the student enrollment, but it's also that same calculation. Remember, they were included in the town foundation budget. That same calculation of the proportionality in terms of effectively the wealth of the towns. So the other part that feeds into Monty Tech is that you have towns and cities that have very different levels of income and property wealth. And I think that that's something that doesn't really get talked about enough, particularly having remembered recent disputes that have happened around Monty Tech's budget, in terms of proportionality of how much does each town have the ability to contribute according to the state's standard calculation. And honestly, as much as there's an amazing wealth of information on these spreadsheets, one of the beefs that I privately have with them is that they don't, I think, break that down as much as they should for the regionals. And as someone who is the Central Mass field rep, who thus has a lot of regionals, I really wish they would, because I think maybe it would, I don't know that it would necessarily prevent as many conflicts as there are at town meetings, but it might potentially get more people on the same page. That, of course, though, because you are a member of the district, you have voting representation, you have a school committee that, again, puts a budget together and votes it. Monty Tech is not funded at foundation either, right? So you're not funding your K through 12 district at foundation. Monty Tech is not funding their district at foundation either. So when it comes to how much is each community actually contributing, what I did was I pulled these numbers straight off of Monty Tech's actual proposed budget from back in March. As my recollection is that that's actually the budget that did pass. So just to give you an idea, though, of where is the actual funding coming from. Now, do keep in mind that this doesn't include whatever grants they're getting, so there's probably a couple more pieces to the pie here. But I did want you to note two things. The first is you're actually the sky blue triangle at the bottom in terms of proportionally speaking, how much is coming from you all. And again, this is your local contribution. But the other thing that I wanted to point out, and I intentionally made this as bright blue as I could, is the big bright blue triangle in the upper left is $10 million, and that's their Chapter 70 aid. The thing that, again, lies behind Monty Tech's budget, which isn't really made explicit anywhere, is because your calculation of local income and property wealth is behind each town's contribution, that then centrally feeds into how much does Monty Tech get in Chapter 70 aid. So I think Monty Tech actually does a breakdown in their budget. I'm not sure I really necessarily would do this, but I can understand why they are, because something that's, I think, important for anyone who's part of a regional to understand is that if your town is contributing less per pupil, your town is thus responsible for more of the Chapter 70 aid that's going to that district. Because remember, the state is always going to fill in the gap. So that's, I think, probably an important story for a regional VOTEC to tell, particularly when it's dealing with such very different districts as Monty Tech is. So that $10.4 million is Monty Tech's Chapter 70, but where that calculation comes from is really all of the rest of the circle. It's your calculation as much as Holden's, as much as Winchendon's. So that's the other part of the story. And that is all of the information I have for you, which has been a lot. And I want to also give you all kudos for deciding that this is something that you wanted to do on a Thursday night, because that was a ton of information. But I'm happy to take any questions you have. And again, I apologize because all of those FY23s are really going to bother me because they're all supposed to be FY22s. I will make many claims, but being able to foresee what FY23 is going to look like is not one of them.
Well, I would ask you to, share that with us.
Absolutely.
And you'll have the opportunity before you share it to change those
I
numbers.
was going to say, I will absolutely go through and change all those to 22s because they are actually current numbers, not next year's.
So I will, I'm going to open this up to the members of the Finance Committee and the School Committee in a moment, but I'm wondering if you could offer some color in terms of what the drivers have been for Lunenburg in your understanding historically over the last several years. So Mr. Cassidy provided a chart, which I think was a look back over several years. And for several years, we did get, sizable increases in Chapter 70, and then they leveled off. I'm assuming that those are these, hold harmless and minimum per pupil aid numbers that we're basically working from now. Did our foundation number in Chapter 70, did that drop as a result of new calculus? Or what happened, I guess, is what I'm getting to, right?
So-
Was it student opportunity calculus? Was it just, all of a sudden property value in Lunenburg just skyrocketed relative to the rest of the world, or what?
So I will certainly defer to Mr. Cassidy because he's going to know your local picture better than I. There are two things. I think the first thing is that the Student Opportunity Act hasn't impacted anything until this year. So we all, I think, have a lot of memories because it took such a fight to pass it. We tried to pass it for 5 years, and then it got signed finally in November of 2019, and then nothing happened for a year. So it isn't the Student Opportunity Act is the first part of the answer. The second thing is you actually, I looked back, you actually have a really interesting enrollment pattern because so I do a lot of these presentations. If you asked me to guess off the top of my head, I would tell you that Lunenburg probably had a slightly declining enrollment and had for maybe 10 years. That's actually not the case, right? You're shaking your head. So this is what's interesting to me. You actually did have a declining enrollment, and then you picked back up again. Now, I would have to go back and look at your numbers in like 15, 16, 17, but you were actually growing, and now you've kind of leveled off again. So my guess, and I'm going to keep looking at Mr. Cassidy's face, is that part of your story is that you actually legitimately had a growing enrollment. The other thing is, and I think this is an important thing for you all to understand, there are a lot of districts in Massachusetts that are at that 82.5 contribution level. There's a lot of districts that effectively can, frankly, fully afford to fund their foundation budgets on their own. You're not one of those districts. You're a 60% contribution district. Does that mean that you're, as poor as Leominster? No. There's a lot of, my own district can fund about a third of its foundation budget in Worcester. That's pretty common among the gateway cities. But you're, as a town, compared to a lot of other towns that probably most people honestly compare you to, and again, I say this as someone who grew up in Sterling, that I would have compared you to, that you're not an 82.5 district, that you don't have as much local ability to contribute, again, based on the state's contribution. You all are the ones who actually set the standard here in terms of what you feel you actually can do. But that isn't the category you fall into. And something that might be interesting for you to do, which I could have, I probably, I don't know if I can quickly enough do it. The combined effort yield comparisons is something that I've been starting to do to towns because it's not something you could easily do on the DESE website. There's a number of places where you can sort of say, like, these are districts that look like us, right, by English learners or right, that kind of stuff. I've been starting to compare it when I have these conversations, actually pull what are the other districts that are at 60% contribution, because sometimes it's not who you think your sort of peer districts are. There's a really big range between, say, Weston and Holyoke, and those are the extremes we tend to think of. But there's a pretty big difference between a district that, you know, I mean, Cambridge is the extreme example. They can fund their district at 2.5 times their foundation budget. But there's a lot of districts that can fully fund their foundation budgets that are at that 82.5. And then you're a 60% contribution district. That's a different category. And again, as, you know, kind of a neighborhood kid, that's not where I would have guessed Lunenburg was either.
You know, it strikes me, this is probably more of an editorial comment than a question, but I'll try to do my best at Jeopardy and turn this into a question. One of the terms that did not come from you tonight, although we got a tremendous amount of information, I feel like I'm going to have to go back and watch the tape a couple of times to fully understand everything that we learned tonight, is Proposition 2.5.
Yes.
Right? So while our enrollment may fluctuate, and while our enrollment at Monty Tech may fluctuate, which is much more substantial in terms of cost than a Lunenburg student,
Yes.
as it turns out, while those numbers might fluctuate, our costs, you know, our contracts with our teachers, which is our largest line item, heating, you know, all the costs that go into running a school system do not fluctuate quite like that, right?
Right.
We have to keep spending more every year at a rate of, you know, on average 3 to 3.5% a year is how our costs are moving. And the state calculus doesn't seem to account for
Yes.
the state law that limits our levy.
Yes.
Right? So is that simply the hold harmless rule, or is there anything else that the state can or should do, in your opinion, to account for that?
So that actually did come up in the Student Opportunity Act deliberation. There was a first of all, there was a debate about it, and then there was a local contribution study that went on, and it happened, but the reporting on it kind of got lost in the shuffle because it happened during the pandemic. And in particular, it has been pushed by a number of districts in the Pioneer Valley, which actually have some of the highest sort of proportionally property taxes in the state, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. And it's for exactly this reason. I tend not to bring up Prop 2.5, mostly because the way that most of the districts are getting to these contributions that are 29% of our foundation and so forth is people are passing overrides. And I mean, does everyone pass an override every year? No. But is that how people have gotten there? Yeah. If I were you and we're going to have a conversation with my legislators, I would go back and pull, and I can find it for you, pull the local contribution study and reopen that conversation with them of, should we go back and look at Prop 2.5? How does the calculus work in terms of revenue and property taxes? How does that then all feed into this sort of statewide calculation? I mean, another thing that was debated, by the way, was, remember, the whole baseline is the state's going to kick in 41%, and the towns are going to do 59%. Something I didn't give you tonight is sometimes I do a pie chart that says, here's what the state says everybody has to contribute, and here's what it actually looks like after everybody did their, additional 29%. You end up with a very different pie chart. That is a conversation that a lot of representatives and senators that represent towns like yours should at least be familiar with, that you probably could pursue.
Okay.
And I mean, I would say just additionally, everybody's going to feel okay right now because, everybody's got ARPA and everybody's got ESSER and whatever else. But I think that maybe the towns and the districts are a little more aware because we're not also sitting on, additional state revenue like the state is, that money is all going to go away. Like, we've got deadlines, and then it's
kidding.
going to be done, and so I would personally argue that the time to have the conversation about the regular kind of picture is now, while we're all saying, okay, we don't have to worry right now, but we're going to go back to normalcy in a couple of years here, and what's going to happen then.
Mrs. Archambault?
Okay. My question has to do with, you mentioned charter school reimbursement change.
Yes.
And so what is that?
Yeah, so I didn't pull those calculations, I should have. So one of the frustrations has been that the deal with charter schools was supposed to be that increases in your charter school tuition or your charter school assessment were supposed to be reimbursed to you at sort of a steadily declining level. It was supposed to be 100% the first year, and then was supposed to be phased out. And those were never fully funded. Like, you'd get the first year, and then that was kind of it. And everybody acknowledged that. So part of the deal in the Student Opportunity Act is now those out years also are funded, and that's being phased in the same way the circuit breaker is. And so far, they've kept their deal. They did the first, all right, to quibble a point, they did the first year. When it came to the foundation budget, they did 1/6 because we're supposed to have a 7-year phase in. Charter school and circuit breaker, they did the first year. So not quite the proportional thing. But they did actually do that. And so for districts that weren't seeing those out years, which was just about everybody, that will be coming in too.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
So again, is it the big sort of boost that the gateways are getting? No, but is it another place that you are probably losing money where someone was running a calculator and saying we're supposed to be getting money, we're not? Yes, the state's actually going to be living up to that commitment.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are you going to include those calculations on?
The charter school reimbursement, I can add it. Yeah, it's not in here, but I can certainly put it in. Thank you.
Dr. Burnham, do you have any questions?
When I'm fixing the FY22.
Brian, can you come up to the mic?
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. Thank you.
Brian Layton and School Committee, thank you for being here. I did have a question, or looking for more clarification or details. You had mentioned transportation and the circuit breaker. I was just hoping you could expand on that.
Sure. So as previously, circuit breaker has a really kind of strict delineation of what counts and what doesn't. And it's based on a per pupil basis. So how much is this individual student costing you, and which services and equipment and so forth for that student's needs are you spending? And then once it gets to what originally was that 4 times statewide average foundation, everything after that you could apply for reimbursement. So there's this nice spreadsheet that the state does of, you said you spent this much in total, this is where you hit the circuit, everything over that we're going to reimburse you at 75%. Part of what, and I will say it's, again, particularly districts like Lunenburg have found, is that many of those students, the reason that they are high cost is that it's tuition. You're sending them to out-of-district placements. And in many cases, part of them going to those out-of-district placements is that you're putting them in vans, and that costs money. And so part of what was noted to the legislature is that it's one thing for us to be reimbursed for the, say, cost of tuition over that circuit breaker amount, but we're still having to fund all of this transportation in order to make sure that we're meeting our state and federal mandates to meet those students' needs. And it, to be fair, tends to disproportionately impact particular parts of the state. So, I mean, if I go have this conversation in Franklin County, everybody in the room starts shaking their head because they're all sending those kids to, Hampshire and Hampden County. That's a lot of money being spent on vans. So what the state said was, eventually we will let you include all of the cost of transportation in that sort of, that spreadsheet you're running for that individual student of how much is it also costing to drive that student to that placement every day. But that's going to be a whole lot of money for us to take on at once. So like everything else in the Student Opportunity Act, they're phasing in your ability to claim that part of the reimbursement. For this first year, they're going to reimburse 25% of what they would usually be responsible for, which is you can sort of, as you're running that calculation and you hit that cha-ching level, now we can apply for reimbursement. 25% of your cost of transportation can be in that column as well. And then it'll be 50%, and then 75%, and eventually 100%. It actually is kind of a big deal because, as some of you might be aware, transportation tends to be kind of a touchy subject when it comes to the state. There's an ongoing dispute with the state over whether or not they fully reimburse the regional transportation reimbursement. You have enough neighbors that care about that I'm sure you've heard that shouting. And of course, part of their ongoing sort of conversation is that, yes, they have, Franklin County Tech, which is 500 square miles, but they also have the city of Chelsea, which is 3. So from the state's perspective, there's a lot of variety out there.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Baelish.
So I guess just really maybe a request is, I'm relatively new on the finance committee, so I'm just trying to understand this and a lot of information, as you said. So one thing I'm interested in is just to make sure I understand. So you've got the minimum foundation, and I think you said it was about 18 million. But then Lunenburg also, we're also funding another 11 or 12 million on top of that to get to the 30 million. Right? And so that's interesting. My request is understanding how that compares to other school districts or other towns. And I think you showed one comparative chart, but that was just the, I forget what it was, the...
Hold harmless.
Yes. But do you have other charts that compare other school districts and towns on those different parameters?
So what I could do is I could go back and run that looking at FY20. The state doesn't report out on 21 until probably about January because some districts are still getting their reports in. But I could give you some comparisons if you didn't mind going back to 20 in terms of how much are other districts spending over their foundation.
Yeah, I think to me it's just trying to gauge the contribution. You said about 60% for Lunenburg of the foundation amount, and then there's an additional amount. So those values to me are very interesting to see across the different cities and school districts.
Are you interested in sort of your neighborhood, or are you interested in like who looks like Lunenburg, or both?
Yeah, I think probably both, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
Yep, take my time again.
Thank you.
Sure.
And particularly because we're part of Monty Tech, it just, sometimes those numbers are really colorful and help to kind of,
Yes.
change
so
the way you look at it.
And you
right?
all will appreciate this. The frustration that I sort of I live next to Wachusett, and Wachusett is one of my districts that I work on as a field director. I mean, they've got one, I think, and I'm going to get this wrong, but they've got a couple of towns that are at their 82.5% contribution, and some of them could contribute over that. And then I think they've got one that's at, say, 40 or 50%. And then, and then they're all supposed to be part of this regional district. And so, in terms of the regional vote tax, you sort of throw all that in together with, 18 other towns, and you just are getting this dollar amount that seems to be coming out of nowhere. I think it can be really complicated. And again, I think that sometimes we have a really good understanding of what we look like compared to another neighboring district, and sometimes we maybe don't necessarily have as good a context for that.
Yeah.
I'll offer my own ignorance that if you had asked me to guess what your eligibility level was, I would have gotten it wrong, and I do this, so.
Any other questions or comments? And I would invite anybody on Zoom to raise their hand if they're interested in
Oh, and I can take this down if that's useful.
lobbing in a question or comment.
because you don't need to keep looking at that. I will say, though, the reason that I give you my cell number and my email address is that you should feel free to use it. And if you didn't jot it down, I mean, I'll have it on the PowerPoint, but that's intentional. I gave you a lot of information. If you get a couple of days into this and say, wait a minute, you should all feel like you can get in touch with me.
Okay. I'm looking at the monitor and I'm looking at my Zoom and I'm getting a little confused. So I'm not seeing anybody's hand up on Zoom. So if you do have a question or comment, please raise your hand. So the reason why I was looking at the monitors, I was looking at the cursor from PAC and it looked like Mr. Jeffries had his hand up. Yeah, he
exactly.
didn't. So, okay. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right. Well, before we continue, thank you so much.
I was glad to.
I greatly appreciate the enormous effort that went into preparation, let alone getting in the car and coming here and presenting for an hour and a half. We greatly appreciate your doing so. I think we will probably have some follow-up questions.
Absolutely.
You've given us, well, I can speak for myself, an awful lot to digest, which I sort of expected. This is not a simple topic.
No.
So,
and I applaud your taking it on, by the way, because there are certainly lots of places where people, just get bitter or angry about it, and instead you've said that this is a learning opportunity, and that's a much better place to come to this from.
let me just ask one more question, and I guess it's probably a good concluding question, which is, we're obviously responsible, the school committee members are responsible to the kids primarily. As finance committee members, we're responsible to the members of town meeting to explain to them why we need more money for this, that, and the other thing, or why we don't think we should spend more money. I think that the calculus here is hard for me to understand as a finance committee member, let alone somebody who walks in on the first Saturday in May to vote on a town budget and just thinks, well, why are we getting less money from the state?
Yes.
Right? And it's literally that simple a question. And obviously the answer is not a simple answer.
No.
If you were in our shoes, which let's take on the role of just advocating for Lunenburg and the Lunenburg taxpayer, what would you ask of a legislator who's representing Lunenburg? Like what is the most pressing problem in all this calculus for Lunenburg, where if somebody could wave a wand, is it just more money for Chapter 70? Is it, changing the numbers for minimum per pupil aid? Is it, what would it be that would shine a more favorable light on Lunenburg?
So I think it's fair to have the conversation around Prop 2.5 local contributions, that piece. I don't think that we've completely conquered that question thoroughly, and I think that's partly because everybody was distracted when we were having it. I think that a lot of people should have a conversation around health insurance. I don't know of any place that saw their health insurance go up by 2.78% this year. I've been looking. The idea there was supposed to be that we all were seeing this sort of diminishing. Part of the reason that towns are having to fund over foundation is to keep up with their health insurance costs. As you said, your largest, the largest amount of money you spend is on teacher salaries. That's true everywhere. The largest amount the school district spends is on salaries, but probably the second most amount that you spend is on health insurance. That's, again, true everywhere. And as that continues to eat up more of your budget, you either have to increase the full budget or you have to cut other stuff, or possibly both. And honestly, that's how we got the foundation budget calculation, because districts were either increasing if they could, or if you're a district like mine and you couldn't, you were just cutting teachers. So, you end up with a whole bunch of a hole there. And plenty of places did both. I think that is probably another thing to really push on, is that whether it's a larger conversation of how do we do health insurance anyway, or it's just the how are we calculating the percentage, I think that those are both really fair conversations to have.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mrs. Archambault.
Yes, I want to thank you very much for coming out. We very much appreciate your words of wisdom on this topic, and we will take time to try and digest it.
Well, and as I said, I'm available as a resource. This is quite literally what I'm trying to do, and to help you be, have more productive conversations. So anything that I can do for any of you, please just get in touch.
Well, we thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do you need to adjourn?
I do. Can I have a motion, Mr. Leighton, and to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
And Ms. Shapiro out there, can you second that motion?
Yes, this is Sophie Shapiro, and I'll second that motion.
Thank you very much. Roll call vote?
Mr. Leighton?
Yes.
Ms. Shapiro?
Yes.
Mrs. Archambault?
Yes.
Okay, we will recess for 5 minutes and reconvene the Finance Committee as soon as we can all find our new locations. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all of that.
Oh,
That
that's
was-
just got the email tonight.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you expect to have a consent calendar for the next?
We have, oh no, there it is, I'm sorry, septic system design, 7:45. You made it.
I actually thought of it after I did this
That's actually
agenda,
a
but I...
combination. Sitting at my desk,
Okay, that's fine. We can do it next
my
week.
home desk yesterday. Looked out my
Just the septic
window,
system design.
heard a bang.
No way.
My side. Cover everything that you had sidebars
You know, those
about.
bears look so like roly-poly and fun, you know, like,
Andrew gave me a hard time
like
about.
eat your face off.
Yeah.
And they...
Greg Roy's
Yeah,
gonna
I
be
put up
there
the
with
bird feeder tour.
Okay, let's
the potential design.
reconvene here. Okay, so we skipped around a little bit to accommodate a little bit of a difference in agendas with the school committee. I do have one announcement / request, which is, or actually I could just ask for a show of hands. Has anybody on the committee registered for the MMA conference or the Mass Association of Finance Committee meetings? So MMA only. Anyone else?
No.
Okay. Does anyone else intend to?
No.
Okay, so we can do that. You may.
I don't know.
Can you decide in the next week so that we can tell Heather if we need to make a transfer at our next meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
The other thing I haven't seen, and it's usually along with the registration, is for lodging at the Weston or
Yeah.
Marriott or whatever's there. That
I haven't seen anything on that
information's
either.
not there.
Okay. All right. I see somebody I need to admit here. Okay. So before we get into, so that was really all I had for announcements. Does anybody else have any announcements?
Our phone call is.
Okay. Seeing as I see a phone number I recognize, I'm going to go back and hit the public comment on the agenda. Is there any public comment?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, Dave Rogers, 82 Highland Street. I thought the conversation and the meeting this evening was very enlightening, and they did a good job. But I do have a couple of questions. And am I wrong when I say that our cost of health insurance has been going down the last 2 years?
So my recollection is that we did have a downward year in the last year as a result of COVID. So let me get my fiscal years right. So we're in fiscal year 22. So in fiscal year 21, we saw two, what I would call rebate months, I believe, or holiday months.
Yeah.
The town manager's shaking her head.
Holiday premium month in fiscal 21, and we had a full month in fiscal 22, but our overall percentage decreased both years.
Yeah, so the overall percentage decreased for both 21 and 22.
Right, that's what I thought. And the speaker, I thought, kind of zeroed in on the high cost of health care as one of the reasons. And I just wanted to make sure that I understood. The second thing is that and this is no slam to the state senator and the representatives that we have, because they certainly do all they can do. But the pure political fact is this, from my perspective. I think, those that represent the large cities have a lot of weight and clout. So I don't mean to paint a fait accompli, but, they really don't care, I don't think, about the constituency, on the other side of 128 and 495. And I don't mean that in a cavalier way. Human nature is they're going to represent what they can, who they represent, and do the best job they can. And so I guess the bottom line from my perspective is that the cards are stacked. I mean, and uphill fight at best. And I just wondered if you or members of your committee, shared that thought or had a different view. And the last thing I'd like to say is that I don't, excuse me, I don't mean to talk against the school committee per se, but I was disappointed that the administration didn't say more relative to this subject. I wondered what your thoughts were. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. To address your question, I'm reminded of the old saying that politics makes strange bedfellows. I think the trick here is to find the right bedfellows. And part of the exercise is to figure out who's in a similar situation and make those connections. Make those connections, and find communities that are in similar circumstances and see if that's enough to fine-tune some of the legislation. So, and maybe that's not possible, and maybe we go through the process and determine that it isn't worth our time or effort. The problem is that, as I see it anyway, is that we have an obligation, I think, as a town to do the best we can at educating our kids. And if we come to a point where those funds are not enough and our needs continue to grow as the superintendent comes forth every year with, an increased needs analysis, and we're put in a position where we need to ask for more from the taxpayers, I want to be able to say that we left no stone unturned. And right now, I think we're just kind of discovering what those stones are. So I think it's worth the effort. And, we may decide several months or more down the road that it isn't worth the time or energy. But in my mind right now, I just don't know. And I want to find out. And I feel like tonight was a good step in that direction. Any other public comment, either from the board or from the public? Okay, hearing none. Finance Committee business meeting. So the first item on the agenda here is to discuss the conduct of the public hearing for November 4th. So a couple of things that I do want to direct your attention to. The town manager circulated an email earlier today with the town warrant on it. So I would advise from henceforth we go away from letters and go to article numbers. And we will do so through the conduct of next week's meeting. But the real question that I've asked some folks who were both at this table as well as one person who's on Zoom is how we should actually go about the presentation and discussion for the building articles next week. So we have two articles that relate to TC Passios. One is a debt exclusion article for the renovation of TC Passios, and one is a design article, an appropriation, not a debt exclusion, for design of a new building, which will essentially replace that building, but with new purposes on that site. And, the discussion in a variety of meetings, select board meetings, TC Passios building committee meetings, finance committee meetings, we've been discussing these over the course of the last several weeks and couple of months as two articles together. But nevertheless, we are charged with having a public hearing that hears articles, and we need to make recommendations on articles individually. So the question is okay, well, how do you do that in the way that you're fair to everybody and the finance committee hears what it needs to hear to make an informed decision? I spoke, Mr. Jeffries called me several hours ago, and we had a discussion about this. Mr. Jeffries, you're welcome to chime in if I don't get this right, of course. But the expectation is that he will be making essentially two presentations combined into one. He'll be representing the TC Passios Building Committee for purposes of Article 7 and the Select Board for purposes of Article 8. And because, in the interest of time, it may make better sense to combine those two presentations into one and hear it as a combined presentation. And I think that was, essentially Mrs. Jeffries' request, and I'm inclined to go with that request and just gather the information as best we can and listen to it presented together. And then facilitate a discussion that is essentially part one can be around Article 7 and part two can be around Article 8. So in other words, listen to the presentation and then divide the Q&A and public discussion around the articles. That's at least where my head is right now. An alternative is we could just do it all at once, have a kind of a combined discussion, and then obviously when we close the public hearing and get into the recommendations, we have to do it by article. But I think it's really up to us in terms of how we want to break down the content for the public hearing portion itself. So that's where my head is at right now. But I wanted to, kind of survey the committee, see what you guys thought before ultimately coming to a conclusion in terms of how to go about running that meeting.
My recommendation would be to hear both presentations. I actually saw them last night, or today, based on last night. I think they should go together. I think public comment should be able to go back and forth between the two articles, because, one may spawn a question on the other, vice versa. And then, like you said, if we're so inclined to make a recommendation after the meeting, which I probably wouldn't be, but then I would go with that. I guess the only question I have is, do we anticipate by next week having actual values out of the
my understanding,
firm?
my understanding from speaking with Mr. Jeffries earlier today is that, yes, we do expect to have some kind of estimate by Tuesday, I guess. So
It's the date Tuesday.
Tuesday will be the 2nd of November. So.
Unless there's new information, I contest that.
Okay. Well, the good news is we don't need to really know tonight.
Right.
So it would be nice to know tonight, but we don't. So,
Yep.
Mr. Passios, do you have a comment on the conduct of the meeting?
Yeah, actually, the TC Passios Committee had that conversation last night. We had Michael Ray do his first run-through on his draft presentation, and when he got done, the discussion was that we are probably going to request that the presentations all be presented during the update article, including Michael Ray's presentation, because his presentation feeds into the information for both the renovation and the tear down rebuild. So we're looking, it'll be a moderator's decision, but we're gonna, actually the Board of Selectmen's meeting and our public hearing will be the dry runs on that, so we can tweak it for a special town meeting. And we do believe that it should be all done concurrently, and then discussion and questions after that.
Yeah, I mean, so they're all obviously different meetings, and they can be run. Obviously, the town meeting itself, we need to move and vote on the articles themselves, and we will need to do that from a recommendation standpoint.
Right.
The public hearing, I think we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we discuss it.
Yeah, definitely. We put a lot of time into also, these presentations are still being tweaked as we speak, and will be finalized over the weekend, I believe. but we're trying to be sure that the public doesn't get confused as we go from one section of the presentation to the next section to the next section, so that the information doesn't overlap and they don't know which one we're talking about.
Okay. Any more discussion or comments on this topic? But I'm feeling more comfortable with the approach that
It sounds
I
reasonable.
described. Okay. Okay. The next item is discuss any additional business pertaining to special town meeting scheduled for November 16th. Madam Town Manager, is there anything more that we need to discuss tonight relative to November 16th? I put it there just because I figured I should.
No information.
Okay. Okay.
The one article got pulled, right? The other one that we deferred on?
The assessors.
The assessor's article.
Yes, so next week we will have 3 articles that will be on our agenda. It'll be, and I don't know the article number, but the fire contract.
3.
3? And then 7 and 8. And that's it. We can certainly reopen recommendations if anybody cares to, but I'd rather not. Okay,
It's already in ink,
well,
being mailed.
it is an ink. All right. Minutes. So we posted minutes, and then I had a couple of subsequent conversations with Amanda, and we made some additions to the minutes for our last meeting. Have people had a chance to look at those minutes? I'm seeing some heads going up and down and one going no. Are we sufficient enough
I
to?
think you've got enough to.
Are we sufficient enough to
approve
vote on them? Okay. So I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes for October 14th.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Evan moved and Chris second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Abstentions?
Abstention.
Dave is abstained. Motion passes. Committee reports. Mr. Passios.
Of course. I actually wrote some notes down earlier, so I wouldn't miss
Let's be
things.
brief.
Yeah, capital planning is meeting basically every Tuesday. We had the fire department in and the planning department in. Fire department, believe it or not, has no capital projects for FY '23. The chief came in and reviewed the capital plan going forward from FY '23. A few tweaks in shifting projects from one year to the next, back and forth in the upcoming years. But as I say, for FY '23, at present, there are no fire department requests.
Are the facilities issues going to go under DPW for that building, or is that not going to come forth?
That'll be under facilities.
Okay.
Yeah. Planning department is asking for $110,000 for, to outsource the complete master plan, all 8 steps to be done all at one time. That will be in addition to the approximately 40-some-odd thousand they have left from the original 50,000 allocated in the first piece of funding. They've done their due diligence. They came back with, no responses to their RFQ or RFP for what they put out the first time, and then with some research, they found that most communities have gone with all 8 sections being done and outsourced. Gets done more efficiently, and, on the surface, it looks like a big number, but it really isn't for what you get out of it. That's it for capital planning at this point. We're continuing to meet with departments over the next few weeks. Parks Department, our RFP is due in, I believe, on 11/2 for the master planning first phase. There is apparently some interest. There were at least two entities that showed up for an on-site walk at the park. And let's see, we will be doing interviews on 11/17, and award the contract on 11/22. We're also still slowly moving forward with a proposal from the Board of Health to put a septic system on Marshall Park, and we are on the agenda with the Board of Health at a joint meeting on this coming Monday. Green Communities, last I heard, there's still some back and forth between the town's attorney and Unitil's attorney. The last communication, I believe, came from the town manager, was that they were going to try one more time to get the questions answered that we're asking on why the cost is what they're quoting, because we feel they can't justify the number they're giving us. If it doesn't get resolved in a very short period of time, town managers suggested maybe in the next week or so, then we're going to request the DPU, Department of Public Utilities, step in and help us mitigate and agree to a cost on purchasing the streetlights. So that's where that's at this point. TC Passios, there's been a lot of discussion. We're also meeting every Wednesday, as well as joint meetings or being at other boards' meetings over the next few weeks leading into special town meeting. Important dates, as we talked about a little bit earlier, November 4th is this committee's public hearing on the two articles. November 10th, we're going to have a community forum. I believe it's going to be in this room in Town Hall, and that's going to be an open meeting, hoping that the public comes and asks some of the questions that we anticipate getting asked at special town meeting, to try to get the information out ahead of time. My latest information is that we will have the final numbers that we've been waiting for by that date, or a few days before. I strongly question whether November 2nd or November 4th we're going to have any numbers, any true numbers. There'll be, an article in the Ledger put in by the TC Passios Committee, I believe it's Friday, November 12th issue. And it will basically give a very brief explanation of the articles, just to keep the information in front of the public and another opportunity to solicit the citizens to come to special town meeting and
When is that?
voice their opinions.
When is that?
It'll come out in the Ledger the Friday before special town meeting. And then, of course, we've got special town meeting on November 16th. And that's it. My other seat is on this committee, so I don't have to report on that.
I have one question for you, I guess. The Capital Planning Committee, per the charter, shall be responsible for providing a complete inventory of town property, real and personal, including school property. Do we have that?
Yes, it is available. We got it last year. I remember. It's a pretty extensive document, but I'm sure you can ask the town accountant or the town manager, but that is available. And it's kept up to date.
Okay. I'd be interested in seeing that.
Is the meeting on 10/10 going to be strictly in person, or is it going to be offered over Zoom as well?
I believe both, and we're hoping that it's going to be aired live.
Okay.
We're going for the whole enchilada if we can get it.
I guess this is just an editorial comment. I'm hopeful that we have a number from the architectural firm around this comparative dollar value by next week. God forbid we don't. I think we need to have a serious conversation about passing over those articles. I mean, we're already, as everyone knows, in my opinion, we're
in waters we don't want to be in.
We are already in waters we don't want to be in with respect to the amount of time that the public has to consider these articles. And I think if we're less than 2 weeks out from town meeting, I think that we're just doing a tremendous disservice to the town. So that's just my editorial comment for that. And hopefully we don't have to revisit it next week. The school committee did meet last Wednesday. I was not able to attend, and the video is not posted, so I cannot report on it, but I will as soon as I can. Are there any other committee reports? Okay. Items for future meetings. So, right now, believe it or not, our only regularly scheduled meeting for the rest of the year is December 9th. So we will have the special public hearing meeting on November 4th. But then the 11th is Veterans Day and the 25th is Thanksgiving. And then we have December 9th and then the 23rd, which I'd be more than happy to hang out with you all 2 days before Christmas, but I'm not sure that you guys want to spend the week with me. So, in fact, I think I might actually be out of town that week. But so December 9th is literally our only regularly scheduled business meeting for the remainder of the year. Right now, I have 3 topics that have come up. I'm sure there are probably more. At the last meeting, Mr. Passio suggested we bring in and have a conversation with the Green Communities Committee. I guess that we are now a committee.
Yes, we are.
To talk about streetlights amongst other issues. I think that in all likelihood, we probably want to have a follow-up discussion about Chapter 70. And in that, we have at least one legislator that has expressed some interest in visiting with us. I think I'm going to open that to our other legislators and have a follow-up conversation about Chapter 70 and anything else that we or they want to discuss in an open discussion. And then the third issue that Mr. Passio has actually brought to my attention this week that I think we ought to think about is ARPA. And not necessarily, I understand that there's a lot unknown about ARPA. I actually did attend the Mass Association of Finance Committees annual meeting last Thursday. They're actually going this Thursday and next Thursday as well, but those will be on demand. I'll watch them later. But last week they spent a substantial amount of time on ARPA. And I can tell you that we have a lot of money that we're going to have a hard time spending, I think. And I think we're going to need to get creative. I think we're going to need to hear from the community. And I think actually having a conversations with our legislators may be worthwhile on this topic. In particular, there are, it's pretty limited in terms of what you can spend ARPA money on. One of them is water, one of them is sewer, one of them is making up for lost revenue. I don't think we have any. One is for basically premiums to essential personnel, which I think we might have a conversation around perhaps collective bargaining on that topic. But the infrastructure one around broadband, I think is something that we need to look at. The problem is that with our funds, given all of the other money that is out there right now in ARPA, I think we're going to be very hard pressed to get any sort of attention from Verizon or Comcast or any other broadband company as a standalone municipality. And I think to spend that money, we're going to need help from the state to do it. But I'm thinking in terms of maybe just asking for public comment on that topic or just having an open discussion about ARPA in general and kind of seeing where we're at come December 9th.
Yeah. If I could add just a little bit to that, Peter. What brought this to light from my side was that when I'm up in New Hampshire, I get a local paper up there every time I'm there, and I pay attention to what's going on up in that region. And there was an article in the last paper that I looked at, and the heading was Whitefield, which is a town near Lancaster, New Hampshire. I'm not sure size-wise exactly how it compares to us. But the article was Whitefield holds public hearing to discuss ARPA funds. So a lot of the cities, or at least the smaller towns up in New Hampshire, their expected revenue from this program is a lot less than what we've got coming in. Yet they're having public hearings to hear from the public as to what they suggest maybe the money could be spent on. So it's just more voices contributing to the process.
So in any event, I'm going to do some research between now and then, and I might re-raise this next week in our business meeting portion after the public hearing. But and perhaps we can bring in some outside expertise. But I feel like we need to keep that conversation going, even if we don't have resolution. Just because I don't want to find ourselves, behind the eight ball a year or two down the road, where anybody who can deliver services relative to any of these areas is fully booked for the next 3 or 4 years, and we don't have the window to spend the money because nobody will take it. And I suspect that actually could be an issue for us.
Most definitely.
Okay. So November 4th, we will be here for the public hearing for the special town meeting. November 16th, we will be at the middle high school for the special town meeting, and December 9th, we will be here. Will you also, Madam Town Manager, have some kind of schedule for budget season at that point, or do you expect that'll be in early January? January? Okay. All right, so we will take that up at our first meeting in January. All right. Any other comments from the board or the public for that matter? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion is from Chris, second is from Dave. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Abstaining? We are adjourned.
Great meeting.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
Recording stopped.